The United States government, led by President Donald Trump, asserts that its naval deployment near Venezuela is primarily aimed at combating drug cartels. Officials emphasize the significant flow of narcotics from Venezuela into the United States, framing the mission as a critical step to protect American communities. By designating certain Venezuelan-linked groups as foreign terrorist organizations, the U.S. seeks to bolster increased operations, presenting this initiative as a decisive measure against international drug trafficking. Nonetheless, security specialists underline that U.S. intelligence reports over the previous decade have designated Colombia, not Venezuela, as the principal conduit for cocaine into North America. This raises issues about whether such a huge operation is being justified under counter-narcotics rhetoric. President Nicolas Maduro and his defense minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez against any incursion on Venezuelan soil. Maduro has threatened to declare a republic in arms if U.S. forces land or attack from the sea. In parallel, Venezuela deployed its own warships and Iranian-assisted drones to patrol the Caribbean coast, while moving 15,000 troops to the Colombian border under the pretext of combating traffickers. Beyond the military, Caracas has also sought diplomatic help from friends like Russia, China, and Iran, countries that perceive U.S. pressure on Venezuela as part of a broader struggle against American hegemony in the global South. Russian Navy experts, for instance, have apparently been supporting Venezuela with coastal defense measures since the scale of forces involved highlights how dangerous the stalemate has become. The deployment includes a guided missile cruiser, 6 destroyers, a nuclear-powered submarine, and amphibious assault ships. Collectively, this amounts to one of the largest peacetime naval operations in the Western Hemisphere in decades. Maduro claimed these ships are armed with hundreds of cruise missiles, calling the fleet the greatest threat to South America in 100 years. Venezuela, although militarily weaker, has turned to asymmetric capabilities. Its drone program, allegedly built with Iranian and even Hezbollah-linked expertise, has been highlighted in state media as a deterrence against U.S. intervention. Some of these drones are claimed to be capable of carrying precision-guided weapons and targeting U.S. naval assets, adding a deadly element of unpredictability. Underlying tensions and ambiguity. The professed U.S. mission of countering drug overwhelming scope of the deployment. Experts think it is more precisely a show of force aimed to shock Maduro, reassure regional allies like Colombia and Brazil, and remind the world of America's military might. This crisis builds on years of hostility. Washington has refused to recognize Maduro's presidency, instead backing opposition figure Juan Guaidó. The U.S. Department of Justice has indicted Maduro on narco-terrorism charges and even placed a $15 million bounty on his capture. Against this backdrop, the naval deployment seems less about drugs and more about regime change by pressure and intimidation. For Venezuela, the crisis has been militarized domestically. Maduro's regime frames itself as the guardian of sovereignty against U.S. imperialism. This narrative not only consolidates his support base, but also diverts attention from Venezuela's deteriorating economy, hyperinflation, and humanitarian disaster. What makes this clash more deadly is the participation of many external players. Russia and China have strong economic links with Venezuela, particularly in oil and military sales, and might use the crisis as leverage in their own disagreements with Washington. Meanwhile, Colombia, Washington's closest friend in the region, remains in a fragile peace process with its former rebel groups, and any spillover might destabilize its borders. Analysts warn that the region is facing a situation where a miscalculation, whether a drone incident, a naval miscommunication, or a border collision, may trigger a bigger conflict. While neither side likely intends full-scale conflict, history demonstrates that heavily armed standoffs may spin out of hand with a single spark. During the presidency of Donald Trump, the United States justified its naval deployment by claiming that large quantities of narcotics were flowing from Venezuela into American communities, making it necessary to send warships to disrupt drug cartels and protect U.S. citizens from what officials described as a flood of drugs. Washington also designated several groups allegedly linked to Venezuela as foreign terrorist organizations, a label that provided both legal and political justification for expanding military operations and, if needed, authorizing the use of force. To the public, the mission was framed as part of the broader war on drugs and terrorism, aimed at bringing criminals to justice and safeguarding American families. However, many experts and analysts argue that this explanation masks deeper geopolitical motives, since the scale and sophistication of the naval force deployed went far beyond what a typical counter-narcotics mission would require. For that reason, critics suggest the true objective was not but to place maximum pressure on President Nicolás Maduro's government, weaken his grip on power, and showcase U.S. military dominance in the region. In response to Washington's actions, President Nicolás Maduro, backed by his defense minister, Vladimir Padrino Lopez, issued sharp warnings that any U.S. incursion on Venezuelan soil would be met with total resistance, even threatening to transform the nation into a republic in arms if American forces attempted to land or attack from the sea. To reinforce this rhetoric, Caracas mobilized its own military resources, sending warships and Iranian-assisted drones to patrol the Caribbean coast, while deploying 15,000 soldiers to the Colombian border under the official justification of combating traffickers, though the real intention was to signal readiness for a potential clash with the United States. Beyond the battlefield, Maduro also turned to diplomacy, seeking political and strategic backing from global allies such as Russia, China, and Iran, all of which saw U.S. pressure on Venezuela not as an isolated instance, but as part of a greater war against American domination in the global South. Reports even imply that Russian naval experts have been working with Venezuelan forces to enhance coastal defense, suggesting that the situation is no longer restricted to Caracas and Washington alone, but has pulled in larger countries whose interests extend far beyond Latin America. What makes this battle extremely perilous is the fact that it is no longer confined to just the United States and Venezuela, but has pulled in other external parties whose interests raise the stakes tremendously. Russia and China, economic ties with Caracas through oil projects and arms sales, have strong incentives to oppose U.S. pressure on Venezuela and could seek to use the crisis as leverage in their broader disputes with Washington, whether over Ukraine, Taiwan, or global trade. At the same time, Colombia, America's closest friend in the area, and a country still fighting to consolidate a fragile peace process with former rebel groups, sits immediately on Venezuela's border, and any spillover from the current standoff might spark instability within its territory. This complex web of actors and fragile conditions has led analysts to warn that the region is sitting on a geopolitical powder keg, a situation where even a minor miscalculation, such as a Venezuelan warship, a misinterpreted naval maneuver, or a brief border clash, could set off a chain reaction that escalates far beyond what either side initially intended. While it is unlikely that Washington or Caracas consciously intends a full-scale war, history demonstrates that in situations of high tension, heavily armed confrontations may escalate out of control from a single spark, converting posturing and deterrent into outright combat virtually overnight.